The exhaustion was a physical weight on Maya Sharma's shoulders. A familiar companion after a 28-hour shift in the surgical wing of Northwestern Memorial. She was a first-year medical resident, a life that consisted of a relentless cycle of high-stakes pressure, sleep deprivation, and the acrid, lingering smell of antiseptic that clung to her hair and clothes. Her new apartment. A small studio on the 5th floor of a pre-war building in Chicago's Lakeview neighborhood was supposed to be her sanctuary, a quiet refuge from the controlled chaos of the hospital. The building itself was a study in faded grandeur, the temperamental elevator and walls that seemed to breathe with the sounds of 100 other anonymous lives. Tonight, the silence of her own space was a blessing. She dropped her keys in the ceramic bowl by the door, the clatter unnaturally loud, kicked off her comfortable, worn-out sneakers. The city lights cast a soft orange glow through her large, single-pane window, painting a silent, moving mural on the far wall. She was halfway through a bowl of instant noodles, the steam warming her face when she heard it, a sharp, solitary knock on her apartment door. It was just past midnight. It's too late for a delivery, too late for a casual visitor. She froze, spoon hovering over the bowl. The knock had been hard, deliberate, not the timid rap of a neighbor looking for a cup of sugar. She set the bowl down and crept to the door, her stockinged feet silent on the worn hardwood floor. She peered through the peephole. The hallway was empty. A fisheye lens distorted the long, narrow corridor, its scuffed linoleum floor glowing under the buttery yellow light of the overhead fixtures. There was no one there, not a shadow, not a flicker of movement. She waited, holding her breath, listening. A moment later, she heard the faint click and scrape of a neighboring door closing down the hall. Of course, someone had simply knocked on the wrong door. A simple, logical explanation. She felt a wave of relief, tinged with annoyance at her own jumpiness. She went back to her noodles, the incident already fading from her mind. Just another strange noise in a building full of them. The next night, the same thing. She had just gotten out of the shower, a towel wrapped around her hair, when the knock came again. This time, it wasn't a single rap. It was a pattern. A strange, deliberate rhythm. 3 quick knocks, a pause, then 2 more. Knock, knock, knock. Her blood ran cold. This was different. This was not a mistake. Mistake is a single knock on the wrong door. This was a specific, repeated pattern. A signature. As she moved to the door again, her heart thumping a heavy, slow rhythm against her ribs. She looked through the peephole. Again, the long, empty hallway stared back at her, a silent, yellow-lit tunnel. There was no one. She stayed at the door for a full 5 minutes this time, listening, every nerve ending alive with a painful, heightened awareness. There was no sound of a neighboring door closing, no footsteps retreating towards the elevator. There was nothing, just the profound, humming silence of the old building. A silence that now felt charged with a terrifying, invisible presence. She was alone, and someone was trying to tell her they knew it. The apartment, once a refuge, was now a cage. Maya spent the next 2 nights in a state of hypervigilant exhaustion, the silence of her home stretching into a thin, fragile membrane that she expected to be punctured at any moment. Every creak of the old building's pipes, every distant siren on the streets of Chicago, was a potential prelude to the rhythmic knock. She took to sleeping with an armchair pushed against the door, a flimsy barricade that did little to soothe the frantic pounding of her own heart. Nothing happened. The silence held. By the 3rd day, a new kind of fear began to creep in. The fear that she was imagining it. That the stress of her residency, the crushing weight of 28-hour shifts and life-or-death decisions, was finally causing her mind to fracture. The thought was almost as terrifying as the knock itself. She decided she needed a data point, an external opinion. She found the building superintendent's office in the basement, a cramped, windowless room that smelled of stale cigarette smoke and damp concrete. The super, a man named Mr. Henderson, with a perpetually weary expression and grease-stained hands, listened to her story with a practiced air of disinterest. A knock on the door, he grunted, not looking up from the small engine part he was cleaning with a rag. "It's an old building, miss. Sounds travel. Probably kids from the 3rd floor. They're always running around. It's a specific pattern," Maya insisted, hating how desperate she sounded. 3 knocks, then 2. It's happened twice now, always after midnight, and there's never anyone there. He finally looked at her, his eyes flat and unsympathetic. Look, I can't file a report for a knock on the door. If they're damaging property, if they're threatening you, you call the police. Otherwise, it's just noise. He turned his attention back to the engine part, his message clear. You're on your own. Maya left the basement feeling more isolated than ever. She was being gaslit by her own building. The superintendent's dismissal, however, had an unintended effect. It solidified her resolve. She wasn't crazy. This was real. And she would not be terrorized in her own home. That night, she didn't build a barricade. She made a pot of strong coffee, sat in the armchair facing the door, and waited. She was a doctor. She was trained to diagnose, to observe, to wait for symptoms to present themselves. This was no different. The hours ticked by. 1 o'clock. 2. The city outside grew quieter. Just as she was beginning to think the silence would hold, it came. Knock, 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 knock. The sound was sharp, clear, and undeniably real. It was right on her door. Maya was on her feet in an instant, a surge of adrenaline washing away her exhaustion. She flew to the door and peered through the peephole. The yellow corridor was empty, as she knew it would be. But this time, she didn't wait. She wrenched the deadbolts open, unlocked the knob, and threw the door open. The hallway was utterly still. To the left, the corridor stretched towards the elevators. To the right, it ended in a window looking out onto the dark brick of the neighboring building. Not a sound. It was impossible for someone to have knocked and vanished so quickly without making a sound. Frustrated, she started to close the door, and then her eyes caught it. Something was lying on her doormat. It was a small, rectangular piece of paper, the kind that could have been easily slid under the door. She picked it up. It was a patient menu selection card from Northwestern Memorial Hospital, the kind she saw every single day, sitting on the meal trays of her patients. Her breath hitched in her throat. Her eyes scanned the checklist of bland, inoffensive food options: chicken broth, mashed potatoes, green beans. And next to the entry for lime jello, someone had drawn a small, neat checkmark in black ink. The cheap printed paper felt heavy in her hand, a profound and undeniable violation. This was a message of terrifying intimacy. Tormentor wasn't just some random teenager playing a prank. This was someone who knew her, someone who knew where she worked, someone with access to the mundane, disposable ephemera of her professional life. The world of the hospital, her world of sterile corridors and hushed, life-altering conversations, had just crashed through the door of her private sanctuary. The knock was not just on her apartment door. It was a knock on the door of her life. She slammed the door shut, the deadbolt sliding home with a series of loud metallic clicks. She leaned against the cool wood, her mind racing, trying to connect the dots. Who? A patient? It's unlikely they wouldn't know where she lived. A colleague? An orderly? A nurse? Another resident? The thought sent a fresh wave of ice through her veins. She pictured the hundreds of faces she saw each week, sea of professional acquaintances, any one of whom could be the face of her tormentor. The checkmark next to lime jello was the most chilling detail. It was so specific, so trivial. It wasn't a threat of violence. It was a demonstration of knowledge, a piece of inside information. It was a way of saying, I see you in your scrubs, in your world of life and death, and I can follow you home. I can stand outside your door and remind you that I know who you are. The next day at the hospital was a waking nightmare. The familiar environment had been twisted into a landscape of suspicion. She found herself watching everyone, analyzing every casual interaction. Was it the quiet orderly who always seemed to be at the end of whatever corridor she was in? Was it the surgical nurse who had given her a cold, dismissive look last week? Every person was a suspect. The constant low-level stress of her job was now compounded by a sharp, personal paranoia that made her skin crawl. She tried to rationalize it. A disgruntled patient's family member, perhaps. Someone who had seen her name on a chart and held a grudge. She spent her lunch break in a daze, scrolling through the hospital's online staff directory, her eyes scanning the hundreds of photos, searching for a face that sparked some flicker of recognition or fear. There was no one. She returned to her apartment that evening. the sense of dread growing with every step she took from the safety of the busy street into the quiet, watchful silence of her building. She had bought a cheap security camera. A small black cube she could connect to her phone. It was a pathetic defense, but it was something. It was data. She was setting it up on a bookshelf opposite the door when her phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. Her stomach clenched. With trembling fingers, she opened the message. It was a single photograph. Picture was of a hospital meal tray. On the tray was a plastic bowl of soup, a glass of water, and a small, square dish of shimmering green jello. The photograph was taken from a low angle as if the sender was sitting in a hospital bed, looking at the meal that had just been delivered to them. Maya stared at the photo, her blood turning to ice. And then she saw the detail that made her drop the phone. In the background of the photograph, out of focus but still recognizable, was the end of a hospital bed. And at the foot of the bed, hanging on a small metal clip, was a medical chart. And on that chart, upside down but still legible, was a name. Dr. M. Sharma. This wasn't a former patient. This was a current patient. Someone she had seen today. Someone who was in a bed at Northwestern Memorial, right now, texting her, letting her know they had her chart, her name, and her undivided, terrified attention. The phone lay on the floor. It screened a small, malevolent eye staring up at her. The image of the meal tray of her own name on that chart was burned into her mind. This was happening now. The threat wasn't a memory. It was a live feed, her medical training. The part of her brain conditioned to react to emergencies with cold, systematic logic took over. Fear was a paralytic. Action was the only antidote. She had to know who it was. She snatched the phone and stared at the photo again, her mind racing through the patient list from her shift. The meal tray, the specific green jello. Hospital food was a depressingly standardized system. Jello was only served to patients on a clear liquid diet, usually pre- or post-operative surgical patients. That narrowed it down. Her name was on the chart, which meant the patient was on her service, in the surgical wing. She pulled on her coat, her hands shaking so badly she could barely work the zipper. She had to go back. Back to the one place she wanted to flee. Back to the hospital. The drive through the Chicago night was a blur. She ran through the automatic doors of the hospital. The familiar smell of antiseptic, no longer a scent of her profession, but the scent of the hunt. She didn't go to the residence lounge. She went straight to the surgical ward she had just left a few hours before. The charge nurse, a woman named Sarah, with tired, kind eyes, looked up in surprise. "Dr. Sharma? I thought you were off. Did you forget something?" "I need to see the patient list from my service today," Maya said, her voice a low, urgent command. "The ones on clear liquids." Sarah, sensing the strange, frantic energy radiating from the young resident, wordlessly turned her computer monitor. A list of names appeared. 7 of them. Maya scanned the names, her heart pounding. Anderson, Chen, Miller. None of them sparked any recognition. No memory of a strange look or an unnerving comment. "Which rooms?" Maya asked. Sarah listed them off. 201, 204, 208, ... Maya began to walk, her footsteps echoing in the quiet, sterile corridor. The hospital at night was a place of hushed beeps and soft sleeping breaths. But for Maya, it was a predator's den. She passed room 201, an elderly man sleeping peacefully. 204, a woman in her 50s, watching television. She reached room 208. The door was slightly ajar. She pushed it open. The room was empty. The bed was neatly made, the sheets crisp and white. A meal tray, identical to the one in the photograph, sat untouched on the rolling table. The bowl of green jello shimmered under the dim nightlight. "Where is the patient from 208? Maya asked, her voice tight, turning back to Sarah, who had followed her down the hall. Sarah frowned, checking her tablet. "Mr. Peterson. He was discharged. About an hour ago. Discharged." The word hit Maya like a physical blow. He was gone. He had been toying with her from his hospital bed, and now he was out. He could be anywhere. Could be on his way to her apartment right now. Who is he? Maya demanded, her professional composure cracking. What was he in for? Sarah's eyes widened at her tone, but she complied. Tapping at her tablet. "Routine appendectomy. A strange expression crossed the nurse's face. That's odd. He's a locksmith, runs a small business here in the city. A locksmith. The word hung in the air, cold and heavy. A man who understood locks, a man who could bypass them with professional ease. The phantom in the hallway, the person who could knock and vanish in an instant, suddenly had a face and a profession. A wave of dizziness washed over Maya. She stumbled back, leaning against the corridor wall for support. It was over. And he knew that she knew. The game of anonymity was finished. She never received another knock, another text. The silence from Mr. Peterson was absolute, but the silence was not a comfort. It was a statement. He had proven his point. He had shown her how easily he could dismantle her world, how fragile the locks on her doors truly were. Maya moved out of the Lakeview apartment a week later. She found a new place in a high-security building with a doorman and cameras on every floor. But the fear remained, a cold, permanent resident in her own mind. She continued her work at the hospital, her hands still steady in the operating room. But her eyes would forever scan the faces of her patients, searching for a flicker of recognition, a hint of a secret. She had learned the hard way that the most terrifying threats do and come from monsters in the dark, but from the quiet, unassuming people you walk past every day. The people who hold the keys,